Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Book Musings. In this episode, episode 13, we're going to take a look at another Stephen King novel. This time around, we'll talk about The Stand. And so, as I typically do in these episodes, I'll begin by giving you a little background in terms of why it is I came to read, or I should say in this case, as was the case in episode 11 when I talked about it, I actually listened to The Stand. I didn't actually read it. So I'll just mention that here at the outset, but I'm going to give you some background, again, in terms of why it is I came to listen to The Stand. I'll tell you a little bit about what the book is about, and as opposed to episode 12, when I discussed Terence McKenna and his Food of the Gods, I'm not going to spend a lot of time chronicling what the book's actually about. Instead, like episode 11, when I discussed it, I'm going to keep my summary or discussion of what the book's actually about to a minimum. You can go online and find all kinds of summaries and discussions of what the book's about if you want. Whereas that wasn't the case, as I mentioned in episode 12, when it comes to McKenna's work, at least in my opinion. But I'll still give you a little blurb or say a little bit about what the book's about. And then I'll move on and discuss, as I like to do, right, my musings or reflections or thoughts on the book itself. Okay, so, and I'll conclude, I should mention, by then grading the book. You know, what Book Musings grade will it earn? Will it reach the highly coveted Book Musings Hall of Fame, and then maybe even that top shelf? We shall see. And then I'll conclude by what's on tap, discussing what future episodes of Book Musings might be. So that's the game plan. Again, pretty typical if you are familiar with the series. That's generally what the game plan is. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and move on to the background for reading The Stand, or again, I should say, listening to The Stand. And before I move on, when I did episode, I think it was 10, I discussed his On Writing, which is actually a nonfiction book he did. And I was wearing my Red Sox jersey, and I went the entire episode without actually mentioning it or discussing why I was wearing it. And so I wanted to make sure I didn't make that same mistake in this episode. So I'm, again, honoring King in a sense by wearing a Red Sox jersey because he's a huge Red Sox fan. So that I wanted to get that out of the way and mention that was the impetus for donning the Red Sox jersey here. And I should say, before I forget, I'll mention probably this maybe a few times, but just in case I do forget, I want to be clear when this was written originally. 1978 was when the first version, the abridged version, came out, and then 1990 was when the unabridged, as he originally wrote it, copy of The Stand actually came out. And I'll get a little bit more into that probably later, but I just wanted to mention then that I read the unabridged 1990 version, or again, I should say, listened to the 1990 unabridged version. So, why is it that I read or listened to The Stand? If you're familiar with any of the previous episodes, you are familiar with the fact that I've been on a kind of a Stephen King kick, right? So it's no surprise then that I dabbled with The Stand, considering that, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, it's usually regarded as one of his best, if not the best, work that he's done. So that and probably it. So those two, I always kind of had in the back of my mind, I want to make sure I read them at some point. I just didn't know it would be quite as fast as it was, right? So especially if you're familiar with my thoughts after having read or listened to it, it's kind of surprising to me then how quickly I turned around, in fact, immediately turned around and read or listened to The Stand, because I wasn't, go check out episode 11 for more details, but I wasn't necessarily the greatest fan of it. But I knew in general, right, in the back of my mind, I do want to tackle these two beasts. Look how huge these are. Right? They're both over 1,100 pages. They are his two longest, again, probably his most well-known and well-respected works. So that was, I guess, in some general sense, I knew I was going to try and tackle it at some point. That was, why I came to it. I just didn't realize, again, that it would be that quickly, but I think it goes way back, and I might have mentioned this in episode 11 when I finished it. I was on a car ride back, and I, was wanting another audiobook, and I had The Stand, so I started on The Stand right away, and I found myself kind of getting into it much more than was the case with it. And so what ended up happening then is I just kept going on with it. So if you, again, are familiar with any of my previous episodes, I mentioned that I've started listening to a lot of audiobooks in recent years when I'm on my runs, and so that was what I ended up doing with the stand. And all 37 discs then I ended up listening to. And again, that was the general sort of what brought me to the stand. I wanted to, before I forget, credit, as I like to do when I discuss audio versions of these books when I listen to them, I want to credit Grover Gardner, who was the narrator, because he once again did a fantastic job. I've mentioned this before in previous episodes, but these narrators, kudos to them. It's one thing to have to tackle, especially Stephen King works, right, which are huge, but then to do it with the way they do, where they're able to sort of pick up the different characters' voices, right? I mean, it takes a ton of time just to go through this and read it, but then they're obviously spending a ton of time in addition to that, anticipating ahead of time. Well, I'm going to have to switch my tone of voice because a different character's starting here and so on. I can't imagine how much work went into narrating this monumental text, right? So again, kudos to Grover Gardner, who does a fantastic job. Really got into his abilities, and I did a fair amount of reflecting, if you can't tell, on just again how difficult narrating one of these books would be. So I wanted to give a shout out to him before I forget. Okay. So I think I covered all I wanted to say in terms of what brought me to reading, or I should say listening to the stand. So I'll go ahead and move on to discussing what the book's about. So as I've already intimated, I'm not going to spend that much time discussing what the book is about. There's tons of reviews, summaries, in-depth summaries of what's going on, what the plot is, the subplots, and so on. So if you're interested in that, at least in more detail than what I offer here, by all means, search the internet. It's all over. So that is the emphasis again for me, not spending too much time on that. Just want to say that here again at the outset. And I also want to mention, as I often do when it comes to doing these episodes, there will be some spoilers. Now, I'm not going to get into, like I mentioned, a lot of the subplots and what goes on and so on, but you will definitely find out, if you're not already familiar with the stand, what happens in the stand. You're going to get a general sense of what goes on, even in particulars here and there, what characters are like and what they do at certain times. So I just want to say that at the outset. If you are one who hates any kind of spoilers, there will be some here, so be advised. With that said, very brief, I'm going to offer a very brief sort of summary or synopsis of what happens in the stand if you're not familiar. And I should mention that it's kind of reflective of what's happened in recent times here the last few years with respect to the coronavirus. Now, that wasn't a driving factor in terms of me coming to read the stand or listen to it when I did, but it is ironic or coincidental, I think, and worth mentioning. It stood out to me as I went through this, like, just how possibly realistic this possibility is. So what is going on? Well, a horrific virus, a super flu of sorts, basically strikes. So it started with the military, and they're doing experiments with these viruses and so on, and they have an accident. And what do you know? It leaks out, and pretty soon it kills 95% or more. I can't remember the exact amount, right? But it's a staggering portion of the population. At least 95% of the population just kills them. And I should say at the outset that I really, maybe this is in light, especially of the past few years and what's transpired, but I really do get into that general plot. What if there was this sort of virus with this killing potential, and it left only a very small portion of the population, left a very small portion of the population remaining? What would transpire? What would things be like? I do get into that. I do like that general plot. So I wanted to mention that here at the outset. So, of course, as the novel unfolds, we meet a cast of very interesting and diverse characters, and we get the unfolding of the classic tale of good versus evil, and the good having to take the proverbial stand against evil, right? So as the novel unfolds, again, you get the sense of there being these two camps, right? On the one hand, you have the good side, and then on the other, you have the evil side. And that, not only that, but then there's this. So who are the camps, right? On the good side, you have Stu Redman, who's arguably one of the most pivotal character, or the protagonist, you might say. Larry Underwood, Glenn Bateman, Frannie, Goldsmith, Nick Ambrose, Tom Colin. These guys are all the guys and girls, right? Are all the sort of good guys. Okay? And then corresponding to that, this is what I was getting at here a moment ago. You have like the supernatural correlation, then representing that good camp, or sort of inspiring and steering them throughout the novel, is Mother Abigail. Then, so this is a very old woman who, again, inspires them at first, primarily just through their dreams. And so, again, she's sort of the supernatural guiding force. It's kind of weird because there's some supernatural components to her, but she actually is a real person in as well. So, but she's kind of the supernatural sort of figure for the good side. And then you have on the evil camp, or the evil side, you have Harold. Harold Lauder is probably the most, the main antagonist, aside from the Dark Man or Randall Flagg. Nadine Cross, the Trash Can Man. So again, these figures are all on the evil side, or the bad side. And the supernatural correlation there would be then the Dark Man. Also, he's a weird figure too, because he's not entirely supernatural. He's an actual figure in the book as well, like a human character that these various characters interact with as well. So, but just wanted to mention, right, that there's this camp, good versus evil, and then in addition to that, you have Mother Abigail and the Dark Man, who have like these supernatural, mystical features about them, and they both inspire their respective camps, if you will, in terms of the action that the respective camps do. And not only that, but like the characters on both sides, they know of the other supernatural entity, or however you want to characterize them, and so they're like responding to them as well. So in other words, Stu, Larry, Glenn, Frannie, right? They're not only sort of inspired by Mother Abigail, but they're also are aware of the Dark Man, and for whatever reason, like they feel that this confrontation with the Dark Man is inevitable, and so on. So both the mystical sort of representation of the good by way of Mother Abigail, and then the same in terms of representing the evil by way of the Dark Man. They're both all of the characters pretty much. In fact, the entire population seemingly are aware of these two figures by way of their dreams. So including all the other characters that you don't hear as much about, but that are they are referenced as knowing of Mother Abigail, and everybody in the population has dreams of her, and so on, are inspired by her, and are worried when she goes missing, and so on. So those are the camps, right? The good versus evil, and I wanted to make sure to flesh those out. So of course the novel builds towards the inevitable confrontation between the two, which, like I suggested a moment ago, both these parties, for whatever reason, they're, I don't know what the deal is, but like, so it's one thing to be aware, right, of the Dark Man and have these dreams about the evil, right, that he is supposed to represent. But then for whatever reason, right, the good camp, they feel compelled to then confront the evil, right, to take a stand. And so that's what the novel, right, proceeds inevitably towards, is this final confrontation. I won't spoil what exactly happens at the very end. I'll mention a few things about the ending a little bit later, but that's ultimately what's sort of transpiring. So I wanted to again mention that they not only have like these visions of these mystical figures in their dreams, but then they feel compelled, like a magnetic force, to come to, right, Vegas in the case of the Dark Man, and confront, I guess, take a stand against the evil that he is and represents. So that's what the book's about. Let's go ahead and move on then and discuss some of my thoughts. So, what are some of my reflections on The Stand what were they as I listened, I should say, to it? I think, again, what really stood out to me about The Stand, and kind of why I was hooked by it, as opposed to maybe say that It by Stephen King, is that I really took to this central plot line, right? This possible plague outbreak and what would happen. To me, that's kind of a novel plot line, or at least one that I haven't encountered so much, versus, It, this coming of age story about, these kids, and growing up and confronting their fears and so on. There's a lot more of that type of book available. So I think I wanted to mention that at the outset, that is one of the things that really got me into The Stand, is that basic central plot line of, what would we do if we're suddenly sort of removed from the comforts of our everyday lives, and most of us who couldn't support ourselves couldn't necessarily survive on our own. What if we were thrust out into this situation where, we had to try to, right, take care of ourselves, where you couldn't just drive down to a fast food restaurant for lunch and dinner and so on. You had to actually come up with your own food. What would that situation be like? How would most of the humans who survived, how would they behave? Which would triumph, good or evil, right? Would most tend towards selfishness and hoarding goods and thinking about just themselves, or would people be more sympathetic towards others and be more inclined to cooperate with one another? I think that's an interesting sort of discussion. I've always got into it. I've lectured on it in my, discussions on moral conventionalism, and my discussions and my lectures on Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. I get into that where they talk about that sort of scenario where, what if everybody was removed from society and had to revert back to a state of nature where there is no society, civilization, or government as we know it? How would people behave? Are most people inclined toward evil or sort of selfishness, or do people want to try to get along and sympathize and cooperate with one another? Hobbes has a much more selfish sort of view of human nature, whereas John Locke, and Thomas Hobbes here, whereas John Locke has a more sympathetic and cooperative view of our human nature. So if you're interested in that sort of discussion, which, again, this plot line explores, you might want to go check out those two lectures in particular. That's in my ethics course, FYI. But this is something I've lectured on and I get into, anything that sort of relates to, well, what is our essential human nature? What are people more inclined towards, good or evil? Or how do we even flesh that out? Those sorts of discussions I get into. And so it's probably no surprise that I did enjoy, again, that general central plot of what would happen if we had this sort of thing, this virus breakout. Okay, so what else? Moving on. Having said that, so I did get into the general plot line, and I enjoyed The Stand. Having said that, though, I have to mention how he has to toss in, right? It wouldn't be a Stephen King novel unless he tossed in what I consider to be the supernatural crap, right? These Mother Abigail and Darkman figures. Of course, it wouldn't be a Stephen King novel, I guess, without that sort of thing, right? But that is precisely that supernatural element. And I've gone on about this in previous King episodes of my book Musings series, right? But that's the kind of thing that's precisely the kind of thing I don't like. And so I get into King as a writer, as a novelist, sans the supernatural stuff. And so I gotta mention that, right? That there is this supernatural stuff going on here. It's not, I wouldn't say it's as prominent as it is in something like It, and I'll get into that more here in a moment. That's probably why I enjoyed The Stand more than It, for sure. But it's still present in The Stand. Again, it probably wouldn't be a Stephen King novel if it didn't have those sort of supernatural elements. But in my mind, again, just how I am, I certainly would have enjoyed it much more if he had just stuck to the basic realistic plot line, right? Sans this Mother Abigail, Darkman stuff, right? Where they're influencing by way of dreams. And I don't mean to dismiss, dreams and what they could potentially mean by any means, right? But when it drives the action to the point where all these figures who have never had an encounter with Mother Abigail, and of course, I guess if everybody was having this dream, then they'd do this. But how realistic? My point is, how realistic is this sort of scenario where everyone dreams about this Mother Abigail figure, and then is then led to everything they do is led to go meet her? I just again, that's the sort of thing. And then their abilities and powers. The Darkman seems to have supernatural powers. I don't get into that kind of stuff. If King instead had just removed all that and stuck to kind of how these people behave and treated one another in an everyday, not an everyday, but like a more realistic sense, I would have liked it even more, the novel, for sure. But instead, we have to toss in again all this supernatural stuff. I don't know what it adds. I guess I would say that I do appreciate that there is a camp that does get into that sort of thing. And so I understand, I guess, maybe the allure for a certain segment of readers. But for me personally, that adds nothing. That supernatural stuff adds nothing to it. Okay. And kind of building on that, I guess one of the other things that sort of stuck out to me is just it's one thing to have like these supernatural elements, but then the degree to which it drives the action, right? It's almost steering almost everything that happens. That bugged me too, right? Okay, it's one thing to have these supernatural elements, but then, as I mentioned, right, where they're going is dictated by this Mother Abigail figure whom they've never met. Granted, they all have dreams of her, but again, the extent to which that sort of thing, this mystical, supernatural stuff, dictates the action, that's even more bothersome to me. And not only that, there are some things, right, that they sort of glean by way of dreams. Like, for example, a character, and I don't have any specifics here, but I just remember feeling this way, where a character would, something would happen, right, with character X, and then character Y would have a dream like the next night, and, you know, they were aware of something that happened with respect to character X, but they didn't, let's say they didn't know character X did it, right, this particular event. But character Y would have this dream, they'd realize, oh, for whatever reason in this dream, they deduced that character X did it. All right, why? Like, why is that the case? And not only that, sometimes, and this is what I was getting at, what they deduced was it wasn't actually even necessarily that important. Right? What the event might have been was like somebody took an extra cup of coffee or something like that. It seemed rather minuscule. Like, why do we need to know that it was, you know, character X? Granted, there were ample times where the characters would glean very important things, right? And that also obviously bugged me, right? Because they would figure out, for example, Tom Cullen had Nick appear to him in his dreams, and so he figured out basically Nick, right after Nick had already died in the novel, he starts appearing to Tom Cullen, the mentally handicapped character in the novel, and sort of told Tom when he needed to leave Vegas and kind of steers him and tells him what he needs to do to escape. So not only were these mystical and supernatural elements present, right, and seemingly frivolous and unimportant facets, right? Why did we need to know that character X took the extra cup of coffee? Granted, it happened in those scenarios, which bothered me. They also happened ample times in critical, when it came to critical, you know, things that happened. Like, again, Tom Cullen's escape. Pretty much it was entirely steered by, again, his visions of what Nick, this dead character, said to him in his dreams. So that sort of thing happens over and over and over in The Stand, and it certainly bugged me. You know, how much was revealed in the dreams, right, of these various characters. That's pretty much how they gleaned almost everything they did. Granted, they would work through certain things via logic and rational discourse and so on with one another. You know, an equal sort of motivating factor for a lot of what they did came from their dreams and, you know, what appeared to them in those dreams for whatever reason. So, okay, that's enough of me discussing sort of my issues with the mystical and supernatural elements and how much of a driving factor that was in The Stand and what happened. Okay. Acknowledged it. I wanted to move on and discuss, so I had a lot of thoughts on The Stand and It. You know, so these two monumental, as I've already alluded to, usually considered his probably two greatest works. And interestingly, they're his two longest ones. They both weigh in at over 1,100 pages. I want to say, yeah, this is 1154. So very long. You know, you're going to invest a lot of time if you're going to tackle these beasts. You're going to have to invest, as is the case, I would argue, with a lot of King's work, a fair amount of mental energy. You know, he's a sophisticated, intelligent author, and so to follow some of what's being said, you know, you're going to have to, again, invest some mental energy. That's not to say like it's difficult or anything like that, but again, 1,100 plus pages, right? These are not easy tasks. Let's just put it that way. So I'm glad to have read them. or listen to them, I should say. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and compare and contrast them. So I mentioned again how much of a beast they each are in their own, in terms of their length and how involved they are, right? So you have these meticulously developed characters in both, right? You get to really know the characters, and that's true of a lot of King novels. He's kind of known for his character development and his characters in general, and so that's certainly true in It and The Stand. You really get to know the characters, and then not only that, but you have these very intricate subplots, subplots beneath the main plot, right, and subplots to the subplots, and so on. So these are very intricate, in-depth texts. They share that in common for sure. And in general, they each have their positives and negatives. There were things I liked about it, and there are certainly things I like about The Stand, and there are things I don't like about both of them. Having said that, I definitely like The Stand much more. Right? I encourage you, if you haven't already, and you want to know more about my thoughts on it, to go back and view episode 11 where I talk about it. But I definitely, from the beginning to the end, I was much more engaged in The Stand versus It. And that's despite, whatever shortcomings, which I've already talked about, the mystical and supernatural, that I found in The Stand. I still was drawn to it. I still was eager to keep moving on. And that very much was not the case with respect to It, especially, towards the end. It was a real slog. So, why is that in general? I think it comes back to, again, the degree to which this seemed more realistic in terms of what was happening in general versus this. Granted, there was still a lot of sort of supernatural, mystical feel to what was going on in The Stand. It still wasn't anything, in my opinion, compared to It, where almost everything that happens in It revolves around, defeating It, which is like this supernatural creature that lives in the sewers and represents, all our fears and so on. So it's like, I don't know if I'm putting this very well, but it's as if It is much more driven and revolves around the supernatural or mystical, or however you want to put that, whereas that's much less of a factor in The Stand. So surprise, surprise, that's probably the point here. That's probably one of the reasons why I was much more drawn to The Stand throughout. Why at the beginning, when I first started listening to it, I got really into it, and even the end, which I'll mention here in a moment, I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of. I still was, going through it very fast. Versus It, which at the end I couldn't. The best thing about the ending was that the book ended finally. So totally different vibes from reading or listening to each of them. And if I had to sort of pinpoint why I think that is, I think again it comes down to the fact that a lot of what's going on in here still seems somewhat realistic, right? We could have, as we've seen in the last few years, and we could find ourselves wrestling with a super virus, right, or a super flu, and how would people react? And discussions about that, that seems much more realistic than a lot of what's going on in It. So that's that. That's, I think, most of what I wanted to say with respect to It versus The Stand. I wanted to make sure I took a few minutes and discussed, sort of how they compared and contrasted, at least in my mind. I also wanted to mention, when I discussed Under the Dome, and I don't remember which episode it was at this point, episode 6, 7, or 8, going pretty far back at this point, I mentioned, I think, in my discussions of Under the Dome, which I liked quite a bit, that they had a television adaptation, a series, right, where they, adapted the text, the King novel, and adapted it for TV. And so similarly, we had a series that came out, The Stand, in 2020, and it had 9 episodes. So I want to talk a little bit about that, because I actually just did finish watching that. My mother, who was visiting for the week, she just left. We watched the entire series, all 9 episodes, and so I want to talk a little bit about that and how it compares and contrasts with the novel. So again, this was put out in 2020. It was a 9-episode series. So the first thing that stood out immediately to me about the series was how it wasn't chronological. It starts in kind of the middle of the book, and then it goes back and forward and back and forward and back and forward, which I think, if I hadn't read it before if my mom, for example, didn't have me there to explain certain things, would be pretty confusing for a viewer. So that kind of stood out in my mind, but I actually kind of liked it because it was mixed things up a bit. So that stood out in my mind, and I'll mention as well that the significant details are changed, much like was the case with Under the Dome. Lots different, the television series versus the actual book. The same was the case here. The film adaptation versus the book, there are a lot of palpable differences. I mean, a ton. Here are just a few examples, and they're not the most significant by any means, but they're just the first few things that came to mind. The judge sent to spy on the Dark Man is a female in the show, and that's not the case in the book. Larry Underwood is African American in this show, and I don't remember that being the case in the book. Nick uses, this really stood out to me for whatever reason, Nick Ambrose. I mentioned him earlier. He's the character that dies and then kind of leads Tom Cullen, the mentally challenged character, leads him on his escape. Nick is, I don't think I mentioned this before, deaf and mute. And so in the book, he has to resort to pen and paper to communicate, whereas in the show, they just have him, Frannie, and I can't remember why, is able to communicate, knows sign language. And so they have Nick communicate by way of Frannie in the show, whereas he has to resort to pen and paper throughout the book. So I thought, those again are just a few of many, many, many examples of how the show, is different than the novel. And I'll just say I don't necessarily mind that because it, if everything was more faithful, if they remain more faithful to the novel, then if you've already read it, you'll kind of just know what's coming. And it might be, in my opinion, it's going to be a little less engaging then. It's a little less suspenseful because, again, you know what's already coming. Whereas if they mix things up here and there, if they deviate a little bit more from exactly what's going on in the novel, then you do feel more of a sense of suspense, and I enjoy that. So, and at the same time, it's not like they steered entirely clear of what actually happens in the novel. It's faithful enough that it resonates with the novel, and you still get the same sort of general vibe as you do when you read the novel. So I think it struck a nice compromise in that sense. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. And so in general, I guess I would say, as opposed to Under the Dome, that adaptation, which I couldn't finish, I enjoyed the television adaptation of The Stand for the most part. I mean, there were things so I mentioned some of the things I got into, right? Not necessarily knowing what was coming next and that sense of suspense. There are things still that I didn't like about the adaptation. I certainly liked the novel better than I did the series. But, in general, I did enjoy watching The Stand. And it's not something I would go back and watch again, per se, but in general, did like it. There were a couple things that sort of stood out. Actually, before I mentioned these two things, I discussed this with my mother, and kind of the first thing she talked about was how she didn't like the smut and the language, and it was kind of, I wasn't expecting it because it was produced by CBS, so I was expecting a much tamer sort of version, but it almost, I had to agree with her, like it seemed like it was in your face, like the sex and language and violence and gore, really, like these horrific scenes. It almost seemed like it was in your face more than the novel itself. And of course, King is known for being pretty gory, so that's saying something. And so I have to agree with my mom on that point. Be advised, if you're not one that likes that sort of thing or can stomach much gore, it is pretty gory at parts, and there's tons of cussing and a lot of sex. So that certainly stood out. That doesn't necessarily bother me as much as it seemed to bother my mom. My two general complaints were this. First, episode 9, the last episode in the adaptation. Everything that transpires in that last episode, none of it took place in the book. It all happens after the ending in the book, which would have been okay, I suppose, if what was happening was compelling and interesting, but in my mind it just wasn't. It just seemed completely superfluous, like it was tacked on, and I couldn't really understand why they would do that instead of creating another episode by elongating what was discussed already, right? And they could have developed, so this is actually a nice segue then into my second criticism. They could have developed some of the key characters that stood out in the novel much more in the series than they did. So, instead of having this weird final episode, episode 9, that really has nothing to do with what happens in the book, why not learn more about figures like Tom Cullen, who seem to play a pretty minor role in the series adaptation versus, how much of a role they play in the novel. And these are very sympathetic characters. I think if you were to poll a lot of the readers who read, The Stand, some of their favorite characters would be the ones that seem to be minimized in the TV adaptation, right? So Tom Cullen, the Trash Can Man, is another, on the evil side. I would have liked to have seen him more. I don't know exactly when he appears, but it's like episode 7 of the adaptation, or episode 6. It's not until the very end. Yet he's an interesting character throughout in the novel. And then, like I said, Tom Cullen, very sympathetic character, the mentally challenged character, right? That he, again, is constantly referenced throughout. Probably the most, maybe with Stu and Frannie, the most memorable character in the entire novel. And yet he plays a very minimal role, I would argue, in the adaptation. In fact, my mom and I were commenting on, there was like almost an entire episode and a half, maybe, where towards the end where you don't even really encounter him, and that's, you don't even encounter him till probably halfway through the adaptation, like episode 4 or 5 to begin with. So, I don't know. Instead of tacking on that final episode, which again has nothing to do with what actually happened in the novel, why not talk more about the kinds of things that were talked about in the novel and that were interesting? Like, for example, some of these characters, develop them more. I thought it was interesting. My mom actually did enjoy the last episode, or, she mentioned as we were watching, like, this is, probably my favorite episode. And afterwards I asked her why. And it was because it actually lacked the smut, the language, the gore that the rest of the episodes do. So it wasn't really a ringing endorsement of the last episode. It was more of a lesser of the evils, I guess, in her mind. But I just thought I would mention that too. So that last episode was weird, I would say. And really do wish, again, that they had, I thought the actors and actresses did a great job. And I thought, I don't know who it is offhand, but the actor who portrayed Tom Cullen did a great job. But let's see more of him. Why didn't we see more of him? That was disappointing. Okay, so enough about which, by the way, where did I put it? Here's the cover for The Stand, the adaptation series. So lots of famous actors and actresses. Whoopi Goldberg, Amber Heard, amongst others, and that. Who was the one? My mom. Alexander Skarsgård. So yeah, lots of people that James Marsden, Greg Kinnear. So lots of people you might have heard of are in the adaptation. So again, all in all, I don't mean to suggest it was terrible. My mom wasn't a big fan. She's glad she watched it once, but would never revisit it. I think I liked it more than her, but I thought it wasn't as good as the novel, as I've suggested. Yeah, I'm glad I watched it, but I wouldn't watch it again myself. And it was still much better than Under the Dome. It might be the best adaptation that I've seen of a King work. And I take that back. Misery was really good. Stand By Me. So it doesn't touch any of those, but I guess in recent years it would probably be the best adaptation of a King work, at least that I'm familiar with. So I'll set that aside and move on. Another thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, and I kind of referenced this at the very beginning when I cited the dates that it was written. So there's a little bit of history here. I want to talk a little bit about this then, or expand on it. So there's the abridged and unabridged versions of The Stand. So what happened, I'm pretty sure I have most of these details right, but I guess I wanted to point out at the outset, I'm not 100% on all these details, but if my memory serves me correctly, what happened was, so the original abridged version that was published back in 1978 was like 400 plus pages shorter. So what was that, 700 some pages, as opposed to the full 1100 plus pages that he had originally written. And that was because economically it made the most sense, according to the publisher, to put out books in terms of that size, or at least that's what they thought would sell the most. So I think he talks a little bit about it in this as well. Sort of what that process was like, and how they said, do you want us to get somebody to trim it, or do you want to do it? And he said, I want to be the one to, to do it myself. So he talks about that process, and that was interesting. But I want to mention that there's an original 1978 version that was released, and it wasn't how he had originally written the novel. So that wasn't actually released. The unabridged version wasn't released until 1990. And again, that's the version, for what it's worth, that I read or listened to, the 1,100 plus pages one. And so, I wanted to talk a little bit about how, or just mention, I guess I should say, how I didn't actually have really a problem with the length of the unabridged version. So I would like to know, part of me, I'm not going to probably go back and do this, but part of me wants to go back and kind of read the abridged version and sort of look more into what had to be removed, because I didn't feel like, I guess the general point is, I didn't feel like this was bloated at all, really. That you heard sort of my general thoughts, and at least in terms of some of the negatives, and I didn't feel like it was bloated or too long. Granted, it's a long book, whereas that was definitely the case with respect to it. So I thought that was interesting. They forced him to cut a significant portion. What would that be, like over a third of the original text? He was forced to trim. Yet I didn't. The one I read, the original text or listened to, it didn't seem that long. So what gives? Why? I almost wonder, which would be better, because I feel like he developed the characters nicely. Would I come away from the abridged version feeling like there was a lot missing? I kind of wonder. So I just wanted to mention that I didn't feel like it was bloated at all. And some King books, that's one of the knocks on King, is that he can seem pretty verbose, and that was one of my huge issues with it. Not the case at all for me with respect to The Stand. Granted, I had some similar issues, right? The supernatural stuff, that sort of criticism I held in common with respect to both. The issue being verbose and having the sense that the novel is bloated, that only for me applies to it and not The Stand. And I guess some of his works, in addition to it, do strike me as maybe a little bit wordier, but that, again, the point here is not the case at all with respect to The Stand. So that was my general, I guess, reflection, knowing that there's this abridged version and an unabridged. Again, what did he have to cut out? I guess I would like to, maybe I'll look into, without actually going back and reading the abridged version, what it was that he had to take out, and I would be interested in that. But, okay, so, blah, blah, blah. What else do I want to say? I guess I'll move on and just chat a little bit about the ending, which I referenced a few times at this point. So another common sort of knock on King would be his endings. He doesn't always land them, if you will. That's at least one of my mother's, her chief criticisms, in addition to being, she doesn't get into the supernatural stuff either, but she thinks, his works tend to be very long and verbose, and then also the ending she doesn't tend to like. So that's a common criticism. What do I think about the ending of The Stand? I wasn't that bothered by the ending. I would say slightly above average, at least for King, is my general take, I guess I would say. As I told my son, I would give the ending a 6 out of 10, right? So it's not quite as good as we'll see here. Probably my thoughts of the book in general. In fact, I would say the last third of the book I wasn't as into as the first 2/3. Having said that, though, I was still eager to move on. As I mentioned earlier, and I was still, listening to The Stand constantly throughout, even to the very end. Granted that I wasn't as much of a fan of the ending, and not just the ending, but the latter third of the book as I was the first 2/3. So it wasn't as good as the rest of the book, but I think compared to typical, let's say, the average Stephen King ending, I think it was probably slightly better. It wasn't too mystical in my mind. We've already been dealing with these two general mystical characters, Mother Abigail and the Dark Man. So there's nothing particularly more supernatural about the ending. There's no, I don't want to, again, there's interesting things that happen in the ending, but I don't want to get into them too much here. But there wasn't, it wasn't too mystical for my liking. I liked how some of the things were tidied up and you felt a sense of closure. I especially like, I'm not going to get into it too much, but who ends up being the main savior. Again, no spoilers with respect to this, but I did get into kind of how that turned out, how, again, things were wrapped up. Granted, there is a lot of death in The Stand. I mentioned how Nick dies, right? There's other characters that die. A lot of death throughout The Stand. You do get, nevertheless, a kind of somewhat happy ending, I would say, and it, I don't want to, I guess, slightly better than average, like I said, I would say, of the ending. There wasn't anything particularly spectacular in the latter, third. Once the main sort of event, I guess, if you will, happens, there's no sort of surprises or anything that unexpected that happens, other than who turns out to be kind of the savior. I did like that was kind of something I didn't expect, but otherwise, there wasn't anything particularly noteworthy about the ending either. So that's why it wasn't extraordinary. This, I would just say, kind of above average. Okay, so again, King here, I would say this is probably true of all of his works that I've read, at least fictional works. He weaves a masterful story. So granted, he can be verbose, maybe he doesn't land his endings, so on and so forth. There's too much supernatural stuff for my liking a lot of the time. He still tells a good story, right? He still has me turning the pages, and that was definitely the case in The Stand. As I mentioned, I was still eagerly going through the latter third of the book, even though I didn't like it as much as the first 2/3. He's still, again, he's a masterful storyteller. So just when you think you have everything figured out, he'll throw in a little curveball, or I like just the little intricacies that he throws in. So one thing that kind of stood out with kind of this respect, right, to me was when Nick, so I mentioned Nick, the deaf and mute one, he is one of the main protagonists for a while, at least. One of the things after just meeting the antagonist, or one of the main antagonists, Harold Lauder, he immediately sort of decides, so they're trying to come up with like a committee to sort of ensure that anarchy doesn't take place, right? That there's some sort of order. And so these main characters, they establish, what do they call it, boulder-free zones. They all kind of congregate in Boulder, by the way. And they establish kind of this boulder-free zone ad hoc committee where they're coming together and trying to sort of establish some sort of structure, almost an initial government, if you will, after everything collapsed as a result of this super flu. They're trying to strike or instill some degree of order. And so Nick, one of the few things he says very resolutely, right, that he's sure of, he doesn't have a lot of things at this point that he's sure of with respect to this committee and the things they ought to do. But one of the things he is very emphatic about after having just met Harold is that he doesn't want Harold on the committee. Now, this is interesting because it takes place right after we learn that Harold reads Franny's diary, thanks to which he confirms that Harold and Stu are an item, that Franny doesn't like. A lot of spoilers here, right? That Franny doesn't like him, right? He's devastated about this. Harold, that is, right? He's devastated about this. So he sets his sights on revenge then, right? So you learn all this, and then immediately, right, he throws in, King, that is, this extra wrinkle where now Nick, right, with very little to go on, sort of intuitively knows that this Harold figure isn't good. And so it's like, okay, now we have this intensity added, and what's going to happen as a result of this, right? Will Harold and Nick get into it? And so he just stokes the fire of conflict even more in that sense. And I appreciate that about King, how he can throw in these added little wrinkles in my mind that make an interesting, compelling story that much more interesting and compelling. Okay, so I think that's it for my general thoughts. So I'll go ahead then and move on to giving my book musings grade. So as you can tell, right, up to this point, I should say, you can probably tell that there are things that I liked about it and things that I still didn't like about it. So does it make the Book Musings Hall of Fame? No, it doesn't. Having said that, on a whole, I did enjoy The Stand. I liked it far more than it. In fact, I would say it's one of my favorites so far that I've read or listened to by him. I would rank it right up there with Under the Dome and On Writing. Of course, On Writing was his nonfiction work. But so I would put it up there in terms of his other novels that I enjoyed. I would rank it right up there with Under the Dome in terms of my favorites. We have engrossing characters, intricate plots and subplots that you really get into, or at least I really got into. And as I mentioned, even the ending and the last third of the book, while not as engrossing as the first 2/3, it still had me turning the page, or I should say, eagerly listening to it. Even, this doesn't happen necessarily that often when I'm listening to a book in my runs. I'll then sometimes, if I'm really getting into it, take it, and listen to it while I'm doing chores in the house. And that was the case for The Stand. So it had me going, to the very end. And so while not as good as maybe On Writing, maybe not quite as good as Under the Dome, it was very good. So I would give it a B. Much better than it. Maybe not quite as good as On Writing or Under the Dome. Didn't quite make, right, the Book Musings Hall of Fame, but a very good book nonetheless. One that I would highly recommend to most people, especially, if you're a Stephen King fan. Granted, it is going to take an investment on your part to get through it. Right? So that's it. That's The Stand. I want to end by talking a little bit about what's on tap for me, what my future episodes, Book Musings episodes consist of. So actually, this is kind of an eerie, weird aside here, but I learned that there was a graphic novel version of The Stand because when I was at the library with my daughters last week, my daughters had like this Girl Scout meeting, and so we had time, when they're doing their meeting, I was out in the lobby and kind of looking around. They had a stand where, that's an interesting way to put it, a stand where they had a bunch of graphic novels. I don't know necessarily what the theme was, but one of the books, or one of the graphic novels that they had on the display or the stand was one of the Stand graphic novels. And so I was like, because I'm listening to the book, I hadn't finished it at that point. So I'm like, well, that's ironic. So I go over there, gets more eerie. So I pick it up, and I kid you not, this must have been like, let's say, there's 6 of them I come to find out. This must have been like, let's say, book 5 of the 6-book series. I flipped to the beginning, and it's literally right where I had finished the last time I had listened to The Stand, right? So let's say page 850 out of the 1,100 pages. Let's say I'd read, I don't know the particulars here, but let's say I'd listened to it earlier in my run that day. The point is, I get there, not only do I notice, hey, there's The Stand, a graphic novel I didn't know existed. I go over, and the first words I read are literally the last ones I listened to at the end of my run when I turned it off. I just thought that was really weird and stuck out in my mind. I don't know, is it supernatural or mystical? Who knows? But so then I was like, oh, that's interesting. I flipped through it. I'm not necessarily, my son is a huge fan of graphic novels, or is my oldest daughter. Not me necessarily, but I did kind of get into it. And so we were at a used bookstore, and I came across these. I need to pick up the other 3, but these 3 were at really good prices, and they're brand new. So I picked them up. I might go through that if I can figure out or find. I think I have number 2 of the series, so I have to track down number 1 to get started. But that was a good find, and obviously very relevant. Wanted to mention that. So another kind of interesting aside. This is how much my family loves bookstores and books in general. And so we were in Colorado. It's probably a month and a half ago at this point, but we're in Fairplay, Colorado. We're wandering around, and we happen to come across the library there, and in the back they have like this used book sale, and it's open, and one of the deals was fill a bag for $10. And so I came across Freakonomics, which I have a hard copy here somewhere. This is a very famous book that came out. It's probably been, I don't know when it was originally published, but I have the revised and expanded edition. At least this is this audio version. And so I picked up this copy in our $10 bag. And once I finished The Stand, my next run, I started on this. So it'll be a much quicker read or quicker listen than The Stand. In fact, there's only 7 discs here, and I already finished disc 1 on the first run. So it started off really good. So I'm definitely going to, I envision finish this one. And who knows, maybe do an episode on Freakonomics. Kind of a nice change of pace there. What else is on tap? So episode 12, if you watched that, was on Terence McKenna and his Food of the Gods. Fascinating stuff. As compared to this, or in contrast to this episode and the episode 11, which were much shorter. Of course, this is going on long enough as it is. But that episode, the previous one, episode 12, when I did McKenna, right, was really long, really extensive. I really got into that book and what it was about. If you're familiar with that, if you watched it, I was a huge fan of the book. It was really interesting, novel stuff that I'd never come across before. I was a huge fan of it. And it opened my eyes and my interest to this world of psychedelics, which you don't hear a lot about. Surprise, surprise. And of course, that's one of the things he gets into, and I discussed that in that episode. But the point here is it really got me then wanting to explore other literature, similar literature. So I picked up he and his brother's book there. I picked up another one of his books, actually a couple of his books, True Hallucinations, The Archaic Revival, which I'm actually reading right now. I mentioned one of the nice things, at least in my mind, about Food of the Gods was how accessible it was, even though it was had an academic kind of feel and was well sourced and so on. I have to say I'm enjoying this one, but it's I find a lot harder to follow at times. So that was an interesting sort of initial reflection. But I can see myself doing an episode on that. I'm even getting into looking at shamans and sort of how the shamanic experience works, thanks to Terence McKenna, and exploring other authors. Timothy Leary, we're all probably familiar with Leary, and his experimentations with LSD and so on in the 60s, and kind of his role and what happened in the 60s and 70s. Rick Strassman, Joe Rogan's had him on his podcast and before, and he talks a lot about DMT. We have always wanted to explore this book. It sounds fascinating hearing Joe Rogan talk about DMT, which I talk about DMT in episode 12, going through McKenna's book. So I could see myself turning to this here imminently, maybe even doing an episode on this. So lots of books lately that I've acquired on psychedelics. No surprise, given how fascinated I was by McKenna's Food of the Gods. I mentioned that I've kind of been eager to explore, or at least in previous episodes, when I talked about the What's on Tap segment of those episodes, I've mentioned how I've wanted to explore Philip K. Dick and also John Brunner, a couple sci-fi authors, so I could see turning to some of their works here. Another, I don't think I mentioned, maybe Harlan Coben, I think is how you say his name. I've had two people recently recommend him, including my mom, who apparently I just discovered this yesterday. He's her favorite writer. So I do have some of his works in my library, I think 4 or 5 of his titles. So I might read one of his books here coming up. And then I guess I just end with, this is one I've been mentioning the last few episodes because I've been working on it off and on for a lot of, probably a half a year to a year now. And that's, I've been dabbling a lot with ancient philosophy because I'm preparing that'll be the next course that, I've started preparing the lectures and so on. That'll be the next course that I provide lectures for online here eventually. Maybe you can expect those probably within the next year. I'll start posting those maybe. So I've been doing a lot of reading with respect to, ancient philosophy. So that's it. That is the wrap on episode 13. Book Musings. We discussed The Stand, an excellent book by Stephen King. Didn't quite make the Book Musings Hall of Fame, but a great book nonetheless. I hope you enjoyed the episode. And until next time, bye-bye.